London. I'm recording today from my hotel where I stayed last night following Jordan Peterson's ARC Forum. And in this video, I'm going to give you my reflections on the public event that I had the privilege of attending last night. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, over the last 3 days, the ARC Forum have gathered in London, which has been a private invite-only experience. Around about 1,000 to 1,500 people were invited to that initial forum, not including myself. So I haven't got any inside intel or observations on the experience of the last 3 days, but I did purchase a ticket of my own to attend last night's kind of finale of the event, which is the public-facing element. So when Jordan originally announced the project, the ARC Forum project, he did mention that there would be this invite-only experience where, you know, a select number of people would come together to explore the issues of our time, which I'll comment on in a moment, and then there would be a public event. And last night was the public event. But first, the question. Well, let's answer the question firstly: what is the ARC Forum? And I'll address my views on what it is and what it is not through this reflection. But the ARC Forum stands for the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and it's described in their own words as an international community with a vision for a better world where every citizen can prosper, contribute, and flourish. Now, with any of these organizations, positive or negative, they always aim to have, you know, nice overall mission statements. And, you know, I'm working on a nonprofit of my own at the moment, and again, playing with these mission statements, they always sound rather grand and purposeful. And it's kind of the done thing, but what does it really mean? But in the context of the wider description of what the ARC Forum is, it says it's an invitation to join us in developing a better narrative in response to life's most fundamental social, economic, philosophical, and cultural questions, which I think is an interesting container based upon what I witnessed last night, and I'll come back to that. It goes on to say that we reject the inevitability of decline and instead are seeking solutions which draw upon humanity's highest virtues and extraordinary capacity for innovation and ingenuity. The website, if you go to arcforum.com rather, it sets out the context for what the ARC Forum is. And I think many of us understand that context if you read it, in the kind of world that we've lived in that's amplified and accelerated in the last 3 years. But what the ARC Forum is proposing to be is an alliance covering business, politics, arts, and culture, to draw on the moral, cultural, economic, spiritual foundations to build a future where citizens take responsibility and work together to bring flourishing and prosperity to their lives. Now, to comment on that initial kind of overview of what the ARC Forum is, because it's already clear that there is a large volume of noise around what's gone on the last few days, and I think some of it is justified. I think some of it is too early to call, but there's this kind of early comparison of the fact that, you know, people are already describing ARC as WEF, World Economic Forum 2.0. And I can see the clear, you know, reasons why, because it's, let's take the last 3 days. I mean, it's not going off to like the tax-free havens of Davos and secret meetings in distant remote lands. It's here in the heart of London. But nonetheless, it is kind of a select group of intellectual, cultural, social elite, if you will, coming together to explore the ideas of our time. It is that exclusive club again. It's invite only. And whilst it's clear that Jordan has the sentiment of building something that is participatory in nature and inclusive of the citizenry, it's obviously it was also obvious at this point they don't have answers to that, and Jordan was clear on that last night, which I'll speak more about later on. But in that regard, I suppose you can see that it's another think tank, if you will, comprising of, rather than necessarily at this point the kind of corporate elite, which the WEF is more grounded upon. The ARC Forum is more comprised of the intellectual and academic and cultural elite. And in many ways, what's fascinating is the culture wars that we are facing and the kind of melting pot of discontent, there is a fight between the old wealth elite, the kind of monetary economic elite, and this new cultural social elite. And many of the kind of subjective post-truth, postmodern on steroids ideologies that we're seeing permeating into society, which is often just wrapped under this idea of woke culture, is stemming from this cultural and intellectual elite that has grown since the 1950s and 60s. So in many ways, what ARC is it's a reaction or response to elements of both the cultural and economic elites, but in itself is currently comprised of a new class of intellectual elites as it stands. So I can understand how people are already skeptical on that basis, but there is another power dynamic here that we have to witness, because it's important to understand power dynamics, because when we look at other people and describe them as elites, whether in the same way I have just done, you know, I'm culpable of doing the same in that, you know, putting these labels on other human beings essentially is a form of identity politics. It's just a different form of identity politics. And what we've witnessed is this fragmentation and atomization of society, which is one of the subjects that was focused upon last night. This role of identity politics, of us and them, this divide and conquer mentality that is pervasive right now, is playing out within the counterculture and the counter movements in a big way. And it's important that we look at and examine our own relationships with power and structures and systems. Because already I'm looking at the responses to what happened over the last 3 days from people who weren't there, who didn't attend it and haven't really grappled with it. And it's based upon kind of an initial perception. And most of those perceptions I'm witnessing are out of a frustration that, once again, it's another group of elites trying to shape society. And I understand and completely concur with that sentiment, in the sense that what we do not need is further, you know, we don't need like an inversion of the WEF just to, you know, put another concentration of centralized power into one space and start to direct society through that means. However, whilst there are plenty of things that I would disagree with Jordan, and there are people that were invited to the ARC Forum, namely Michael Gove and several others, who I wouldn't necessarily associate with, I do also value the importance of building bridges with people who have different worldviews and ideologies to ourselves. We're living in a fractured world, which is becoming increasingly fractal and fragmentized, if that's even a word, fragmented, as such that we are increasingly trying to only associate with people like a Rubik's Cube, who have like the exact precise formula of views and beliefs that we hold ourselves. And I shared a meme with this recently that, you know, if we continue to unfollow, I mean, this is like social media, like life in the digital realm, unfollow. If we continue to unfollow people who have different views to ourselves, then eventually we will just be looking ourselves in the mirror, and we'll be confronted with our own fragility and recognizing that we don't actually even truly know ourselves. And therefore we're left alone, because all of a sudden the people who you thought were on your side have the different view on subject A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And the danger of that is we start to pursue this like utopian cult that is homogenized in its thinking, that is completely aligned in every perspective and viewpoint. But no, we're seeing it with every issue, from COVID to then Ukraine, and then to Israel, Palestine. And now it's just like boom, 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 break. And we need to be able to go past that, I feel, to hold the space for respectful dialogue, so that we can deepen and enrich our understandings with, you know, it doesn't mean that we have to agree with other people whatsoever. And it doesn't take away from that emotional charge that comes within us when some people say things that are deeply contrarian to our own. But I do think it's really important that we hold the space, because what's happening right now is we do get these clubs or cults that just create their own ecosystems and therefore become detached from reality. And if they gain too much power and influence, such as the WEF over time, then look what happens. This is what happens, is because we've polarized ourselves so extensively. And in the case of the WEF, they've operated, if you're a football fan watching Manchester City like dominate the football for several seasons, or Manchester United before, what is it about Manchester football clubs? I don't know. But if you have a single team dominating a league or a competition, then it makes it very hard for anyone else to compete. And that's the nature of monopolies. And what we've had is a monopoly on the marketplace of ideas, which has really been encapsulated by the World Economic Forum and related organizations like the Bilderbergs and the Club of Rome, etc., who have long dominated the marketplace of ideas and played a strong role in permeating our cultural and societal norms and the breakdown of the social contract and traditional values. However, that said, if you look more deeply and see the kind of the nature of ESG and this whole framework that has emerged from within these organizations, and look at the kind of new forms of activism that is moving through the corporate channels. Part of the reasons why, even today on Twitter, it's trending, go woke, go broke. Many of these corporations are actually under a lot of pressure from activists who are, rather than trying to make their voices heard and their change through the political means, which have often failed, and they're now going through the corporations. You've got an entire spectrum of political movements who would traditionally rail against corporate authority, who are now utilizing corporations as their tool. And there's not a simple relationship, simple binary relationship between corporates and the elites and the social trends that we're seeing. It's complex, but either way, it's shaping how society is at the moment. So to come back to the point, is ARC simply an inversion of the WEF? On the surface level, you could make that comparison. As I stated, it's a group of intellectual, academic, social, cultural elite who are coming together to mull upon the issues of our time. Now, there were people in the room over the last 3 days who I do know and trust, and I will be looking forward to catching up with them and hearing about their experiences. I probably, looking at the guest list, know maybe 5 to 10% of the attendees, and if not personally from studying their work. And I'm really keen to understand the kind of nature of the setup, because it's unclear. It's the inaugural meeting. The last 3 days was the inaugural meeting, and what can we tell from that? But what we can tell, obviously, is the structure of invite-only, non-participatory experiences that at least are being broadcast. If you want to see if you actually want to see the talks from the ARC Forum, you can see them on the YouTube channel, which I'll put in the links within the context of this broadcast. You can see some of the talks. But again, here's the thing, talking about coming back to the track of power structures. I mentioned the need to build bridges and hold containers for us to have a wider and deeper exploration of ideas. Now, what I think is happening with the ARC Forum as an early observation is that, and particularly since Jordan Peterson has combined forces with Ben Shapiro, with the Daily Wire, who are an overtly conservative, traditionally focused Judeo-Christian platform, and that's just said objectively, there's no judgment of that point. I'm not attached to any structural meaning. But as an observation, what that brings is really a energized and fresh take on, I suppose, traditional values and the incorporation of the God-shaped whole in harking to Judeo-Christian values and looking at the role of religion, the church, etc., upon society historically, and the decline of religion and the according decline in moral standards and the outsourcing of moral authority to a new class of influences in the corporate elite and glass towers. So what was evident through last night and through the talks that took place over the last 3 days is there is a fresh take on these traditional values. And as such, I think what will happen is and there's many people who have written about this and take it as a little c conservatism rather than the political sense of Labour versus Conservatives or Republicans versus Democrats, for instance. But there is much written about the idea that the counterculture will be conservative, little c conservative, talking about the meaning of conservatism, which is conserving things that we ought to be looking to defend, preserve, and protect. If you think about it on a sliding scale of conservation progression, in simple terms, taking the politicization out of it, I'm sure we'd all agree at different levels of subsidiarity that the things that we need to preserve, and there are things that we need to progress. And I think what's happened in the last 3 years, and I do love taunting my particularly left-leaning liberal friends on this, have become described as alt-right or right-wingers during this time because they are responding with conservative energies, meaning that they want to conserve our liberties, they want to conserve free speech, and they want to conserve some of the fundamental bedrocks that our democratic society is built upon. Therefore, they're behaving in a sense of with conservation and conservatively. So I think what JP is bringing is, as I said, a fresh take on not only conservatism, little c conservatism, but also traditional values drawn from Judeo-Christian values, which we can see a resurgence in. There's a lot of people now who turn in times like this to religion, to the church, and different religious institutions to find meaning once again, to find something beyond themselves. This is again, as an observation, this is a predictable pattern that if you look through history, whenever there is a crisis of meaning or a physical crisis, then people start to look outside themselves when the things that they've lost trust in, like institutions, politics, and academia and media, etc., they then turn to something that is more wholesome or potentially deemed to be more wholesome. So I think what's going to happen is the ARC Forum, in the way that it's taking on this fresh take on traditional values and bringing the elements of religion as opposed to a wider esoteric spirituality, I think Jordan and the ARC Forum will draw people and institutions from places like the WEF, because there has been no diversity in the marketplace of ideas. You've almost got this globalist, hyper-atheist organization that has rejected God and now has left no room for such discussions. Whereas last night, my overarching sentiment, it was about an invitation to bring those conversations back into the table. And rather than last night, there was the Bjorn Lomborg, I'll speak about who were on the panel in a moment. All the people talking about Michael Gove in the comments, he may have been there last night, but he wasn't part of last night's event. The panelists were Jordan Peterson, who's the primary host, Bjorn Lomborg, Douglas Murray, Jonathan Pageau, and then Ben Shapiro made an appearance at the end. Again, you can see the allegiances between Jordan and Ben Shapiro playing out. So I think the ARC Forum, even if it is simply an inversion of the WEF, the fact that we've had no competition, to use that sporting analogy again, Manchester City dominating, effectively what you've got now is a Newcastle United, a Tottenham Hotspur. I've lost track of the football. I support a small Torquay United, National League South, struggling local family community orientated team. I have no idea about what's really going on in the Premier. I've kind of sort of adopted Bournemouth now that I've moved there. But my point is simple, that these large institutions have dominated the marketplace of ideas, culturally, socially, and economically. And not only have they dominated the marketplace of ideas, they've also dominated with an exceptional amount of wealth and capital. So I can foresee things like the ARC Forum starting to fragment and pull people away from the WEF. So what you'll see now is and it's already happening, memes of like, this person is part of the WEF and now they're part of the ARC. That's not surprising. Let's use our common sense on that, because there has been no alternative. There's been no alternative. And we need alternatives. We need diversification of ideas. Now, do I think the premise of having these elite think tanks determining the future of society? No, I don't think that is the way forward, but I do think it is necessary that there is greater competition to these single-focused. It's not single-focused. It's a single ideological worldview that has permeated these institutions, from the Club of Rome to the World Economic Forum, Bilderberg. They're all built upon the same foundational ideologies, which are shaping society as it is. So we do need a counterbalance to that, and I think there is a role to play. There is a need for a competitive competitor in that landscape of ideas. Now, and therefore, I do think we will see the atomization and fragmentation of things like the WEF. I think because there has been no room for those who are more conservatively minded, or those who are more spiritually or traditionally spiritually orientated. There's no role for conversations about God or Christianity or any other spiritual tradition of the many. Whereas now I think the ARC Forum is bringing that piece to the table. And last night, the discussion was rather philosophical in nature, and I think that was inevitable given Jordan Peterson's role in the forum. It felt like the Jordan Peterson show last night, Jordan and Friends, which I was a little bit disappointed by, in the sense that I'd gone there to learn about what this ARC Forum stood for and what their aims and aspirations were and what had happened the last 3 days. And it was really only touched upon. That said, the exploration of ideas around our cultural context and the need for a new narrative was exceptionally important. I mean, coming straight hard out of the gate with the need for us to create new stories, to move away from this idea of doom mongering, fear mongering, catastrophization, permacrisis, contraction, scarcity, which are kind of the guiding rule of the current elite, and move towards a forward-focused, optimistic vision of the future with belief, faith, and hope, so that we can enter into a phase of flourishing prosperity and well-being, and use human ingenuity and our capacity to create solutions even against the hardest odds to prosper. I think the need to alter that story is so real that I was very much delighted to hear that was the opening kind of gambit about the need for new stories. Charles Eisenstein has been talking about this for a long time, talked about some of the principles of voluntary participation, where there is no imposition of coercion or force in policies. These are certain things that we've taken for granted in the West that are no longer certain. Talking about the relationship between the individual and society and something higher than ourselves, talking about the need for us to psychologically grow up and clean up, something that is spoken about in other circles as well. Ken Wilber and the integral theory. There's loads of really interesting thoughts around that, about how in the digital realm in particular, we've kind of don't have the same level of psychological development. I mean, look at Twitter, for instance, or any social platform right now. I mean, anything, a fight could just break out in the comments right now, and no one's going to go, well, hold on, mate, calm down a bit, let's just go outside, take a breath, like you would in the pub if something altercation broke out. We're unable to take that into the digital realm and just hold the space. We don't have the respect and mutual kind of kindness or compassion just to listen to one another and go, well, I hear what you're saying there, mate, but I've got a different view on this. We've lost the ability to interact in the way that we see with each other, that we connect with each other in this digital realm. It's all very much like me, narcissistic kind of like, it's not a dialogue. And I appreciate, like, I'm talking to you, watching this now, and in the replay, like, I can't connect with you directly. I can see you in the comments, but I can't respond to every one in a dialogue sense. But my point is that we need this psychological maturity. And Jordan, as a clinical psychologist, talked a lot about how, some of the foundations and traditions that help us, and rituals and habits that help us to mature as an individual and as a society, have been lost. This comes back to this point of preservation, is that we're throwing the baby out of the bathwater in our current society, and we're becoming more atomized and isolated. The things that normally bring us together as communities and a sense of belonging and a sense of something moral in our ethical judgment has been lost in the way that the tide is unfolding. So there was lots of real discussion around treat ourselves in order to treat others well. Interesting dance between our own selves and the world around us, and are with others, and how once we take responsibility for every level of our being and our relationships with others, getting ourselves together, so to speak, then we're able to really to make a difference. And it was clear that Jordan is grappling with the idea about personal responsibility, which I think is absolutely key and essential to what we're dealing with here, and the relationship with society. And it's clear to have a solution about how to make this ARC Forum more democratic and participatory. That was one of the closing questions to the panel that no one could really answer. But there was some really interesting discussion across the panelists that I mentioned, Bjorn Lomborg, Douglas Murray, Jonathan Pajot, and then Ben Shapiro for a very short period at the end. You know, I'm not one for like tokenization of panels or like just simply diversifying the marketplace of ideas for the sake of it, or this kind of, you know, just there's not enough this type of personal minority in the discussion. However, it was overtly white masculine, you know, white male rather. And I think that looking at the talks from the pre-sessions on the previous days, there were some really great female voices that I think were absent last night. And I think part of really my view of the world of going forward is how we become more holistic, how we become more balanced, how we find greater equilibrium, because the conversation that took place around the role of the family and what happens in union. And today, by the way, is my 4th wedding anniversary. My wife and I are in different parts of the country today. I was there obviously in London for last night, ready to launch her gym. So I'm traveling home shortly. We're going to celebrate our 4th wedding anniversary tonight, but talked so importantly about the role of our relationships. And that shone a light for me as how important these structural bonds are and how they play out in the world. And the forms of relationship to another, but the kind of masculine and feminine and how they interact and support each other and enable and empower each other are so important. There was such a richness. I mean, a lot was covered, a lot of ground, but as I said, a lot of it was rather philosophical and cultural in nature, and a lot of people were kind of wanting the practical. Bjorn Lomborg brought it back to this, like, the story of how the UN came up with like these 180 goals. And I mean, you try writing 180 goals yourself and delivering on them. You know, I know there's some massive goal achievers out there will go and do these things, but how do you prioritize having 180 goals is having no focus. And he talked about the practical elements of what's most important in finding, you know, the smart solutions to world problems that are economically viable and preserve human rights and liberties, you know, which is so obvious, but we've lost that. So there was a really interesting discussion around that. I mean, I took loads of notes. Like it was if you've been to the O2, the lights were off. I can't even read my writing today because there was no way to see what I was writing, but there was lots in there around integrity and the connection between ourselves and others. But yeah, as I said, the kind of the gaps. How do we take an organization like this and actually bring it back to a more participatory experience? But I want to close with the kind of comment as I began to speak around on our role of our relationship with power. I've mentioned about how there's been a complete lack of competition in the marketplace of ideas. So, you know, there simply has been no alternative to the WEF. And, you know, many people have already said in the comments that, you know, ARC are the WEF in sheep's clothing. I don't think that's true. I think it's really like the white sheep and the black sheep. I think they are of the same breed, but potentially in the same category of species in the fact that they're an elite think tank at this stage. But it's so early on, you know, it's so early to really make such a judgment. And I think part of what we need to do now is not act so instantaneously on our own outrage and our emotional connections to things. Look what happened to the Gaza situation, like moral outrage. Like we just constantly jarred by this moral outrage into a position that we haven't really thought about or looked at the complexity of months or history on. But that's a separate rant. But even if the ARC is another elite think tank in a different suit, at least there is now wider competition in the marketplace of ideas, which is necessary. Particularly within the intellectual elite, which have important influence on our cultural trajectory, rightfully or wrongfully. But examining our own relationship to power, it's all too easy to call out an elite who have money, influence, or even intellectual prowess that is greater than our own. And by our own volition, what we do then is pedestalize others. We put others on a pedestal as this elite, and by virtue of doing so, we put ourselves in a pit. We create this dynamic, this power dynamic between ourselves. And in doing so, then we start to feel marginalized and oppressed, this sense of inequality. We then take the role of the victim and place blame on others for our circumstances, which really is the dance in which last night's conversation emerged in, is that when we do that, what we're really talking about is, or what that really amounts to, is some form of envy and resentment of what others hold. And rather than transmuting that into something that brings us into our full power and personal responsibility of our own to aim for something higher for ourselves, it places us into this victimhood where we wallow in pity and we create that us and them, and we say that all the power is outside ourselves. And that is the continual dynamic that I've witnessed in the last 3 years. And every time something like this comes along, there's just like, there's just this like rock throwing. There's rock throwing from people who are not in the arena. The really, you know, the old quotes throughout history about really to critique where we are in society requires us to put on the armory and to get into the arena in order to really to take the wounds that come with the battle of forging change. And that really is the message, because when we feel marginalized or oppressed or envy or resentment towards others, we create this culture of entitlement, this idea that someone needs to change things for us, or there's going to be some hero, or you know, the government is going to come and save us, or like if we fall on our feet, then mummy and daddy are going to pick us up again as adults. You know, we really do need to grow up. That really is what we're talking about here, and finding personal responsibility. And not to say that, you know, people turn to the government for a social safety net, for instance, because the community bonds are broken, where family units would look after each other and communities would look at each other. We become so isolated that we don't have that anymore. So we turn to the governments to fulfill that need, but it becomes a sense of entitlement. We've lost that sense of personal responsibility. So when we create these power dynamics in our own minds through our own volition, we start to wallow in pity. And if we're to break free from the influence of the so-called elites and to democratize how we shape society, then we need to break this pattern of thinking and to return to personal responsibility for our own circumstances, our own welfare, and the mark that we can make on the world, which interestingly was the overarching message of last night's event, which is how do each one of us rise to the call and find courageousness to step forward, to tidy our own rooms, Kaz, as she said in the comments. It's important that we do that, because otherwise things won't change. We're looking outside, we're saying, oh, this group of people are coming together to shape society. Well, of course, because everyone else hasn't even tidied their room, metaphorically. So the message I took from last night was get yourself together. Get yourself together. I took tons of notes. It's a mirror. Last night for me was a mirror. It reminded me how important my relationships are and the responsibility that I have in each role that I play in society, as a man, as a father, as a husband, as a son, as a brother, as a friend, as an associate, as a colleague, as an activist, as a leader, as an entrepreneur. What role am I going to play in society, and how can I shape myself for the better so I can tidy up my room, so I can mature, and I can find ways to make a difference in my own way? Because if I don't, then somebody else will. You know, it's like, if you don't have a plan for your life, then somebody does have a plan for your life. That's how people end up in the machine. So there is some important messages from last night. I'm taking it all. And, you know, as I'm watching the comments to this video, like, you've got to look for an objective lens and see the sense of disempowerment that is within the collective consciousness right now and our relationships to power. And if we really want things to change, we have to find our own power within ourselves. And we can't just sit and complain. We can't just sit and criticize and call everything controlled opposition and chill. Like, it's just, what use does that do in the end? Like, okay, if it is the case, then what's going to be done? What are you going to do? Like, that's the question. How do we individually and collectively make a difference? And the easiest answer is, how do we tidy our own room? How do we take responsibility out? How do we create an impact in our own life that is so magnificent that we radiate possibility to others, that we lead change? And what we have is people turn arbitrarily to leaders to create change rather than leading themselves. So it's time to lead, it's time to find courage, and it is time to get into that optimistic, beautiful vision of tomorrow that we each have the capacity to create. Because right now we live in a bleak world where everyone is painting this vision of catastrophe and the next thing that's going to wipe out humanity. We need new stories, yes, but it is us that hold the pen. And what story will you write? So there are my reflections from last night. There's a lot more that I could say. It's not a simple dialogue, but thank you very much for tuning in. Please do share this broadcast. I'm off now to meet with Sam X to discuss what we're going to do next with the Uncharted Territory podcast and the conversation around the financial reset. So I'll be back next week. Thanks very much for tuning in. Have a great weekend, and I will see you very soon. Big love for now. Enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, P.S. Join the mailing list, danastingregory.com/pandemic. Join the mailing list. We're making some changes to the podcast soon, and with the challenges of free speech, it's incredibly hard to keep content actually live on these platforms. So please join our list to make it easy to reach you. Good evening, good afternoon.